Good morning, everyone. It's Rabbi Dr. Jack Cohen. Today in Hebrew it's called the Shloshim, the 30th day. It's the 30th day of my mother's passing, and in honor of that event, I decided that I would study the tractate of Makos or Makot, which deals with all types of witnesses and how to deal with witnesses and beautiful areas of judicial system details. So I'd like to give a nice Devar Torah. Today's Devar Torah theme is called David HaMelech takes the entire Torah, which is 613 commandments, and encapsulates them into 11 foundational principles, making it much more easier for us to be able to serve Hashem. Let's start with Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis, and it says there, Rabbi Simlai expounded that there are 613 mitzvahs in the Torah, which we know about. And they're broken down like this. 365 of the commandments are negative commandments, which are symbolic of the 365 days of the solar year. And 248 commandments represents the limbs of our body, which total up to 611. So where are the other two? So the other two are the first two commandments of the 10 commandments. Anochi Hashem, I am Hashem your God, is 612. Lo tiheh Elokim achirim, you should not have any other gods, which totals out to 613 commandments. Now what's going on here? What is the Gemara trying to teach us? And very simply, that in the olden days when people were very focused and laser focused on their service to Hashem, they were able to do all the 630 commandments with tremendous kavanah, concentration, which was necessary in order for you to be able to get into the next world. David HaMelech came around and he saw, you know what, the generations are no longer on the same level that they used to be. People are declining in their spiritual capacity. So he said it's not possible for people to be able to earn the next world with 613 commandments because they can't do them as effectively as the older generations. So he went ahead and did us a huge favor, and he took the 630 commandments and he was able to consolidate them down to 11 principles, which we will learn. These 11 principles are in the parak or the chapter 15 of Tehillim. Ted Vav parak Tehillim are these concepts. Some important points that I want to bring out is that, again, the Rivan, which one of the commentaries of the Gemara would say that all 613 commandments were required to be done with proper intensity for us to be able to get into the next world. As time went on, the spiritual level of the nation declined, and people were not able to fulfill the commandments. So David HaMelech came and did us a huge favor, and that's very important. Now, so what are these 11 requirements that David HaMelech brings down? Number one, Holech Tamim, he walks in perfect innocence. We'll explain what that means. Poel Tzedek is a person who works, that he's a laborer, an employee, but he's very careful, very honest to serve his employer with extreme honesty. V'domer bet b'labo is the third one, and he speaks the truth from his heart. Lo ragala l'shono, he doesn't have lashon hara on his tongue, is number 4. Number 5 is lo asa le'ero ra'ah, he does no evil to his fellow man. Number 6 is v'cherpa lo nasal kiravo, it doesn't cast disgrace upon other people. Number 7, nibzeh be'enav nim'as, he finds Rishaim, wicked people, contemptible, and he doesn't give them honor. V'tireh Hashem yichabed is number 8. He honors those who fear God. Number 9 is Nishba la'arav lo yamir. He can swear to something that would be to his detriment without retracting. That means he'll take an oath for something that would be not good for him, and he won't retract, but he'll be able to fulfill that. Number 10, Kaspol Natam beneshech. He doesn't lend his money with interest. And number 11, he doesn't take a bribe from other people. We'll explain what that means by giving illustrations for every one of the points that David HaMelech brings down. He starts by saying, who's going to dwell on your holy mountain? So I'd like to share an amazing story with you about a Hasidic Rav. His name was Sfas Emes. He was one of the great rabbis of the Ger dynasty. He was actually elected to become he was raised and nominated to become the head of the Ger dynasty when he was 22 years old. His father had orphaned him at the age of 8. His grandfather, one of the great Ger Rabbeim, the Chidush Harim, had raised him. When it was announced that at 22 he was going to become the head of the whole Ger dynasty, people protested and said, what? 22 years old? A kid? He's going to lead us and tell us what to do? So they went ahead and, they accosted him. They said, you're too young for this. And he said to them something fascinating. He said, let me tell you a story about certain individuals who wanted to climb the highest mountain in the world, Mount Everest. And they prepared for weeks and weeks. And they trained because it's high altitude. And they had to go hire scouts and prepare all types of food and provisions for weeks. And they went ahead and they started climbing the mountain. Along the way, people died from their expedition, individuals that came along the journey. When they finally got up there, they only had a few people who started the journey but made it to the top. When they got to the top, they saw an incredible sight. They saw a young man just frolicking, enjoying himself. It looked like he was, walking around with some of his goats, as if he had no care in the world. And they looked at him with amazement. They were with their gruffy beards and their scruffy beards, and they said, "What are you doing here?" And he said to them something fascinating. "Gentlemen, you're visiting. I was born on the mountain." And this is what the Sfas Emes looks at these people who are protesting against him becoming the leader. He goes, "I was born on the mountain. I was elected for this." Meaning that we as Jews, we're born on the mountain. We have all the tools necessary to serve Hashem. All we have to do is study the Torah and focus on the mitzvahs. We have everything we need because we're special already. So the next point that he makes is like this. Number one, the first of the 11 requirements that David HaMelech says you need in order to serve Hashem with excellence is you have to olech tamim. You have to walk in perfect innocence. The Gemara tells us, who's that talking about? That's talking about none other than Avram Avinu. Whatever Hashem asked him to do, he did. He didn't ask questions. He just went ahead and did it like a loyal soldier. I have a beautiful story to share with you about a rabbi who served Hashem like a loyal soldier. After World War II, Eastern Europe's yeshiva world was wiped out. And there was one man called the Panovich Rav, Rabbi Yosef Kahneman, who started rebuilding and created the rebirth of Torah in Eretz Yisrael. And he had to travel quite a bit in order to be able to raise funds so they could support the yeshiva. And this is 1964. He's sitting in a taxi with Dr. Moshe Rothschild, the person who founded the hospital in Bnei called Ma'anei Yeshua. And the doctor wrote in his memoirs, "I'm sitting next to the rabbi in a taxi while we're going through Rome, and the rabbi's talking to himself, I'm going to get revenge from that guy. I'm going to get revenge." He says, "I'm going to settle the score with that man once and for all." And the Dr. Rothschild doesn't know what the rabbi's doing. Maybe he's, hallucinating. When suddenly the rabbi tells the taxi driver, "Take us to the Arch of Titus." Titus was the person who destroyed the second great temple, the Beis HaMikdash. And so the taxi driver did as he was told. The rabbi gets out, he straightens his tie out, he, collects himself, comports himself, walks over to the Arch of Titus, which is right there in Rome. If you've been there, you may have seen it. And he then starts to speak to the arch while all the Italian citizens are watching what's going on. And he starts talking in a booming voice, "Titus, former emperor of Rome, where are you? 2,000 years ago, you tried to obliterate the Jewish people and leave no remnant of us. But listen to my words, Titus. Who knows who you are today? If you walk around the streets of Rome and ask people who you are, no one would even know who you are. Is anyone in the world who bears your legacy? No, Titus." He says, "I just came back from Bnei Brak, from my yeshiva, where in 1964, he says, 500 people are studying Torah." Now imagine, ladies and gentlemen, what that number is like today in 2025. How many thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews are studying Torah in Israel today. And the rabbi continues, "Titus, you disgraced the Holy of Holies," because the Gemara tells us that Titus, when he destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, brought a prostitute into the great holiest place in the world. "But I invite you now to come to the Western Wall, where you see people stayed up day and night, praying and hoping for the rebuilding of the great temple, eagerly awaiting its rebuilding. That's the clearest possible sign that our Beis HaMikdash, the third great temple, would be rebuilt soon." And he closes his comments while the Italians are not upset with what they're hearing, but he doesn't care. He's not in any way afraid of them. He says, "Titus, you've been forgotten forever. Your name has been forgotten. But we, the Jewish people, will remain forever, and we will yet blossom again." Let's move on. So this is the first one we said, someone who serves Hashem with complete innocence, like Avram Avinu. The second point that David HaMelech says that you need to be able to have in order to serve Hashem with excellence and get into paradise is Upal Tzedek, a righteous employee. The rabbis tell us this is talking about a man, a Tana from the Gemara. His name was Abba Chilkiah. He was so careful that when he worked for his employer, when people tried to say hello to him in the middle of the day of his working, he wouldn't answer them because that was like stealing from his employer, and he refused to do that. So now number two, when David HaMelech says one of the requirements is to be Poel Tzedek, a righteous worker. Number three, V'dover emet babo, and he speaks the truth from his heart. And the Gemara tells us this is talking about a rabbi called Rav Safra, who put something up for sale for $200, or 200 zuz at the time. And then he was saying Kriya Shema, where you're not allowed to interrupt to speak to anyone. The person came and made the offer of 200, and Rav Safra would not interrupt Kriya Shema in order to talk to him. So what happened? The man said, "I'll give you 300, I'll give you 400, I'll give you 500. He wanted the item that Rav Safra was selling very badly. When Rav Safra finally concluded his prayers, He walked up to the man and he said, it's okay, I accept 200. Because in my heart, I had already agreed to accept 200. He could have easily taken the 500 or 600, but no, he refused to do that. He spoke the truth from his heart. Number 4 is Lo Ragal Shono. He doesn't slander anyone. One of the requirements, David HaMelech says, to serve as Hashem with excellence is to avoid speaking Lashon Hara. Who is this talking about? So the rabbis tell us this is talking about Yaakov Avinu, who represented Emes, who represented truth. As it says in the Torah about Yaakov Avinu, when his mother, Rivka, came to him and said to him, go in and get the brachas from your father Yitzchak, and he said, Ulayam Sheni Avi, maybe he'll feel me because my brother is a hairy guy. Esav was known to be hairy. And if I'm discovered that I was, impersonating my brother, I'll be seen as a deceiver in front of my father. So the rabbis tell us, interesting commentary, the Rivan tells us that Yaakov Avinu refused to go in and listen and comply with his mother's request to go in and get the brachas, because he wouldn't do that until his mother told him she had prophecy, that the prophecy told her that it's okay for you to go in there and get it, and then he acquiesced to his mother. And secondly, what does he mean he never spoke Lashon Hara? Yaakov Avinu knew his brother Esav was a rasha. He knew he was a criminal and a bandit. But all the years that he knew that, he could have walked into his father and told him, Abba, what you think about Yitzchak, about Esav is wrong. He's really a wicked boy. He never did that. Not once did he speak Lashon Hara about his brother Esav. The next point that we want to say that David HaMelech brings down in order to be able to earn Olam Haba is, Lo asa le'ro he doesn't do evil to his fellow man. What does that mean? Shelo yored le'emunato chavero. He doesn't go and set up a business to compete with his friend. Let's say if a person sets up a grocery store, he doesn't go and open another grocery store directly across the street from him or next to him and create competition and cause pain to his fellow. That's what I mean. That's what it means. One of the points that David HaMelech brings out, that he doesn't do evil to his friend in business. And the next point he brings up, he doesn't cause disgrace to those who are close to him. What does that mean? This is the kind of person, we know what he does, this guy? He tries to bring people back close to Hashem. He helps people in Kiruv, and that's critical. He helps people in Kiruv. And I want to bring out an interesting story. A young secular Jew living in Tel Aviv was once looking at the family photo, and he saw an old man with a big beard. He wasn't a religious fellow, this young man. And he says, Ima, who is this? And the mother says to him, that's your grandfather. He was a rabbi. He was killed in the Holocaust. Why? What happened? He says, you know what happened? Towards the end of the war, he was in Auschwitz. And the war was almost over. The Russians were coming very soon, and the Americans were coming, and the Germans knew there was any day they were going to lose the war. So one of the Gestapo officers approaches his grandfather, and he says, you see this piece of pork? Eat it now. If you don't, I'm going to take this gun and blow your brains out. And he could have easily acquiesced and saved his life, and he said, no, I refuse to eat it. He said, listen, I'm going to blow your brains out. He didn't listen. And the German officer went ahead and pulled the trigger and killed him on the spot. And he was shocked. Years later, this man who had gone to move to America, moved back to Tel Aviv as a prominent businessman. He was successful. One day his wife calls him up. He says, honey, I'm not going to make dinner. Could you bring home some sandwiches? So he stops into a famous restaurant called the Pink Elephant in Tel Aviv. And he looks at the menu and he's getting, they're famous for their basar lavan, their pork. And he's getting ready to order 2 pork sandwiches when suddenly the thought flashes in his mind. He says to himself, my grandfather died and not eat pork. I'm going to go and pay for it? I can't do that. I must be crazy. That started to get him to think. And then he said to himself, I can't do this. He eventually became a Baal Tshuva and went on to become the head of Arachim, which is an organization. His name is Rabbi Yossi Wallace. An amazing book called Incredible was written about him by Rav Nachman Seltzer. It tells the story of this man who went on to help hundreds and thousands of Jews that were secular rediscover their roots and their Jewish heritage. He's responsible for hundreds of thousands of people coming back. So one of the great points that David HaMelech brings out that would be necessary for a person to earn Olam Haba is to help others come back closer to Hashem. Let's move on. And the next point he says is like this. Nibzeh be'enav nim'as. This is a person in whose eyes a rasha is contemptible, and he doesn't give respect to a rasha. This is talking about Chizkiyahu HaMelech. Chizkiyahu HaMelech was one of the great grandsons of David HaMelech. He was a righteous king. He was a person who served Hashem with all his heart, and he was the one who encouraged all Jews to study Torah. His father, Achaz, was a wicked man. He was the king prior to him. He was not only a worshiper of idolatry, but he incited and encouraged and motivated and forced people to worship Avodah Zarah. When Chizkiyahu's father, the Rasha, the wicked man Achaz, King Achaz, died, he didn't give him a state funeral. Instead, they took his father's body. They wrapped it up. They put it in ropes and they dragged his father's body, the former king of Israel, around all the streets of Yerushalayim just to show, this is my father, he was the king, but he was a wicked man and he desecrated God's name. He worshipped idolatry and he caused others to worship idolatry, and for him we don't give honor. Even if the fact if he's the king, but if he's a wicked man, we dishonor him. And the next point that David HaMelech says you need in order to be able to serve Hashem with strength and alacrity is Ve'et Yireh Hashem Yichabed. This person honors those who honor God. What's he talking about here? So the Gemara tells us Zeh Yehoshaphat ben Yehuda. It's talking about King Yehoshaphat, who was a righteous king. What did he do? Whenever he would see a Ben Torah, a Torah student, a Torah scholar, he, the king, would stand up and clap, and he would embrace and hug them, and he would call that person my father, my teacher. Now, a king, a Jewish king, doesn't have to do that. A Jewish king certainly doesn't have to stand up for anyone. He's not allowed to do that. He's not allowed to be able to withhold his honor or diminish his honor for other people. But there is one exception, and that is when it comes to giving honor to the Torah, then you do it. A king, a Jewish king, can stand up to honor Torah. Such is the greatness of honoring the Torah, which brings me to a beautiful story about one of the great Rosh Yeshivas, deans of yeshivas of America. That was Chaim Berlin Yeshiva, where I had the pleasure to study for over 14 years. And the founder was Rabbi Hutner. And this is going back to 1963. He was invited himself to give the opening speech at the dedication of another yeshiva called the Yeshiva of Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn, New York. He wasn't sure what did he want to talk about that day. And he started to think, and then finally he had a thought, and he started to ask himself, the person who started the first yeshiva in the modern era was Reb Chaim Volozhin, the student of the great Vilna Gaon. Reb Chaim Volozhin did something very interesting. He changed the term of the students from being called Talmidei Yeshiva, which is students of the yeshiva. He changed it to Bnei Yeshiva, sons of the yeshiva. So the rabbi asked himself a question. I wonder why Reb Chaim Volozhin changed the term of the students from being called students of Torah or students of the yeshiva to sons of the yeshiva. Why did he do that? But he was perplexed. He couldn't figure out. That day, he was walking in his own high school when he approached a senior student who was about 17 years old, and he asked him a very interesting question. Young man, I have a question to ask you. And he said, yes, how can I help you, Rabbi? He says, young man, I have a question to ask you, and that is, tell me, what's the difference in your relationship between your relationship with your Rabbi, who teaches you Hebrew or Hebrew studies, versus the relationship you have with your science teacher? And the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Cohen, says, you know what? The answer that the kid gave me was brilliant. I'm sure he's going to go on to greatness. Listen to the answer the kid gave him. He says, then Rebbe, I'll tell you the difference. The difference is like this. The relationship that I have with my Rebbe is like a baby nursing from the mother. That is an amazing relationship. It's an eternal relationship. That's a relationship that's forever. It's priceless. Versus the relationship that I have with my science teacher is like when I go down to lunch and I get food and it's just dumped on a platter and given and shoved in my face. It's very, very temporary. The relationship we have with our Rebbes, the adulation that we have for our Rebbes, the honor that we give our Rebbes because of the Torah they represent is second to none. And this, David HaMelech tells us, is one of the key requirements to be able to serve Hashem, is to give honor to the Torah. Next point that he raises is like this. What else do we need to do in order to be able to serve Hashem with excellence? Is that Nishba hara velo yamir. He can swear and take an oath for something that's going to be bad for him, and he won't retract. The Gemara tells us it's talking about Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was not so wealthy, and he was invited oftentimes to come and eat dinners by the head of the Jewish organization at the time called the Nasi, the president of the community. And every time he was invited, he would say no. He would say, you know what, I took a fast upon myself. He didn't want to give himself extra conveniences or luxuries in this world, so he refused to eat. So I want to share an amazing story with you. Years ago, during World War II, we know Iran is in the news all the time. In Iran, there was a famine. A Jewish family was making a wedding. So they sent two 10-year-old cousins, Moshe and Yitzchak, to pick up the bread that people would wash on for the Seudah at the wedding. When the boys got into a fight, no one decided to take the sack of bread, and they just left it in the street. 20 years later, a Gentile, an Iranian Gentile, walks in to the Kala's father's store. He used to sell fabrics. In passing, he says, God really took care of me. About 20 years ago, which was about the same day as the wedding, my family was starving. I left the house because I couldn't bear to see my children die from starvation. There was no food. I walked down the street. I suddenly came across a sack full of bread. I brought it home to my family, and it lasted until I was able to find a job. And so the Jewish man says to him, what color was the bag? Do you happen to remember? And he says, the Gentile says to him, yes, it was a unique black, green with red stripes. That was the bag that the boys had abandoned that eventually saved this man and his family from starvation. So let's go on to the next point that David HaMelech says we should look for qualities in order to serve Hashem. He says like this, Kaspo Natan Beneshech. We're talking about someone who lends money without interest. Afilu biribis ovid kochavim. It refers to someone who doesn't lend on interest even to a non-Jew. The law is you're not allowed to charge interest or accept interest or give interest to another Jew. But here he's saying something more. You are allowed to charge interest to a Gentile, but David HaMelech says if you avoid that, you're even on a high level. Try to not lend out money with interest to Gentiles. And the last point that he says, V'shochad ala kilu lakach. He doesn't take a bribe from the innocent. What is that talking about? The Gemara tells us it's about Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi. What happened there? Rabbi Shmuel was the head judge on the Jewish court. And he also owned the field. And he had a sharecropper on his field. That sharecropper, every Friday, would come over to his house. The sharecropping relationship was like this. The sharecropper would work the land, and in return for working the land, they give a certain percentage of the harvest every week to the owner, which is Rabbi Yishmael. So every Friday, this man would come to town and give Rabbi Yishmael a portion of the produce. One week, he came on Thursday, because Thursday is the day that they adjudicate claims in court. And so he came, and Rabbi Yishmael said, how come you're one day early? He goes, you know what? I figured I have a case in your court today. Let me give you what I owe you. At the same time, you'll hear my case. Rabbi Yishmael says, whoa, you have a case in my court? There's no way I can hear the case. I have to recuse myself because I'm going to be biased since I already make money off of you. And so he did. He recused himself. The man went into court. Rabbi Yishmael decided to sit in the sidelines and listen to the case. And lo and behold, guess what? He found himself feeling bad for the man. So he said to himself, thank God I decided to recuse myself. And that's another great point that David HaMelech writes, that you don't allow yourself to ever be biased if you're a judge in a case because someone is close to you. So the Gemara closes out the subject by saying the following. When Gamliel used to read the last pasuk would say, David HaMelech would say in Psalm 15, if you do these 11 things, lo yemod, you won't make mistakes. Rabbi Gamliel started to cry. He says, guess what? It doesn't say all these things. If you do just any of these things, David HaMelech is telling us, take the 613 mitzvot. I've now summarized them for you into 11 principles. And even all 11 you don't have to do. You just have to do some of them. And if you do them with sincerity, you'll certainly be one who's called Ben Olam Haba, a person that'll make it into paradise. In the spirit of the incredible Devar Torah, my mother's neshama, Esther Bat Julia, have an aliyah, have an elevation today, and she should go into Gan Eden speedily and in the merit to all the mitzvot that we do. Have a wonderful day.